So given a limited budget, where should you spend and where should you save? Should you go baller on the frame but cheap out on everything else? Should you spend the money on some fancy shifters or on the rear derailleur? That's what we're gonna talk about today. We're gonna walk through a bike and I'm gonna give you my opinions on whether you should spend or save your money on certain components. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, this channel is all about the non-competitive side of cycling, riding party pace, and living the supple life. And if you're digging the content on the channel, consider supporting it. We just came out with some fun merch, these party pace pins, and our tongue-in-cheek gravel-specific patch. So looking at the bike, it can be broken up into two major components. One is the frame, and the other is the componentry. So that's everything from wheels, tires, crankset, all that stuff, everything that is not the frame. I've done a fair number of bike consultations where people are really agonizing about the perfect frame set, about the frame material and the geometry and all that stuff, and are struggling to economize for everything else. My basic advice is you definitely want to spend a good amount on the frame, but don't blow your budget so you end up with cheap components. Definitely buy a frame that's gonna have the geometry and handling that you want. But if you're deciding between two pretty similar frames in terms of geometry, but one has fancier tubing, I wouldn't sweat that too much. Yes, there are differences, but you don't want to blow all your money on that exotic tubing bike and build it out with cheap components so it doesn't really shine. Don't lose sleep over whether your bike has 898 tubing or 747 tubing. Those things matter, but by the time you put all the components on your bike, the differences are pretty small. Okay, so moving on to the touch points, your saddle, your handlebar, and your pedals. For the saddle, definitely spend as much as you need to so you have a comfortable saddle. A bike that's uncomfortable, no matter how fancy the frame is or how fancy the components are, you're probably not going to ride. So find the saddle that you like, but if your behind has very particular tastes, then that is definitely a place where you want to spend money. I would say the same would apply for the handlebar. We're really fortunate these days insofar as there is such a wide variety of handlebars. Everything from alt bars to drop bars with really shallow drop and flare. So if there's a handlebar that you like that's gonna keep you riding more, then spend that money there. In terms of pedals, you guys know that I am a big fan of flat pedals. One big advantage of a flat pedal, it can be less expensive than a cycling specific shoe and pedal combination. I think this is one of the first places where you can definitely economize on. Yes, I like big fancy alloy pedals, but I also love less expensive composite pedals. I find them plenty grippy as long as they have the right shape. They also tend to be lighter and don't cost as much money. In terms of a specific pedal recommendation, I'm a big fan of the EC Thumps. You know, I reviewed one a couple of years ago and have since bought 4 or 5 pairs for all the different test bikes that come in through the channel. So yes, the OCD among you may cringe a little bit when you see a nice bike with composite flat pedals. But honestly, if it fits your foot and you don't slip off, you know, that's all a pedal has to do. Another place where I think you can economize is the headset. Yes, I love a baller Chris King headset as much as the next bike nerd. But for me, I'm also perfectly content with just a pretty basic and reliable Cane Creek headset. So if you can live without all the color options, you know, a basic Cane Creek headset is the way to go and a good place to save money. The next place I would economize is the seat post. I've found that relatively inexpensive seat posts actually perform pretty well. One thing you can do is if it ships really long is to cut it down and that'll shave you a couple hundred grams. Okay, so let's move on to the more controversial picks here. The next is the shifters. The shifters is a place where you can really save a lot of money. I think middle end shifters shift just as well as their higher end cousins. They may not be as light or as refined, but they're gonna be just as functional. And if that saves you a couple of $100 where you can put elsewhere, then definitely do that. I would actually go a step further, and you know, if you're definitely on a budget or you want to do kind of a cave of bad ideas build, do something crazy. Use a friction shifter. Use bar ends or Gevenol shifter or some other kind of hackery. I think in general, people tend to overspend on high-end shifters when their function is pretty basic. And unless you're racing and you need super precise shifts because it's gonna cost you a paycheck, you're just blowing money. So in that vein, interesting budget shifters I would recommend are the Gevenol shifters, anything by Microshift, their bar end shifters, their thummies. I even like these funky Dicomp Any wing shifters that I have on my Rivendell. And the big advantage of going friction or kind of non-normative shifter is that you can hack it so it plays well with mountain bike gearing. So let's talk rear derailleur and cassette. These are places where I do think you should spend some money. Save on the shifters, but get a decently light cassette, especially if you're going one by and are thinking about doing a wide range, something like 11 to 50. There are cheaper Sunrace options that cost about 40, 50 bucks, but you're almost putting a pound of metal on your rear wheel. And also the rear derailleur, I wouldn't suggest buying the most high-end spec, but definitely get one that will cover the range that you want. Looking at cranks, this is another place where you can economize, especially if you're going one by. The more money you spend, you're not getting, kind of more functionality out of it. You are getting lighter weight. So if you're a bit of a weight weenie and want to drop some weight, a crankset is a good place to do it. But if you're someone that values function and wants to get it on a budget, then any mid to even low mid-range crank will do the job. So moving on to brakes, I think this is definitely a place where you should spend some money. My favorite brakes, currently are the Yokozuna Ultimos, which are a hybrid hydraulic / cable actuated brake, or the Paul Clamper. Yes, these are super spendy, but I think good brakes are really important, especially if you're going bike touring or bike packing and have to stop yourself, your bike, and a load. This is a place where you don't want to skimp out on. Skimp out on the shifters, but go baller on the brakes. All right, now we're gonna talk wheels and tires, and this is where I think you should spend as much money as you can. Especially in the tires, these are the only part of the bike that touch the ground, and they make such a big difference in terms of ride quality and the terrain you can ride on. If you economize on everything else, definitely spend the money on the tires. Another thing which in recent years I've come to understand really transforms how a bike rides is the wheels. I think there's a tendency to take wheels for granted since they come on every bike. I mean, that's just what makes a bike move. But after having the chance to ride some nicer and lighter wheels, it is one of the single most transformative components that you can put on a bike. If you look at my review of the Aventon $600 gravel bike, I put some carbon wheels on it and it felt like a completely different bike. Everything else was junky, but the wheels were good and the bike was transformed. I would even go so far as to say that if I were to spend more on the frame or the wheels, I would probably spend more on the wheels. A nice set of wheels also, especially if they're disc brake, you can move them from bike to bike to bike. So they are a better return on investment in the long run. And again, you don't want to have a beautiful frame that's weighed down and doesn't reach its full potential because you cheaped out on the wheels. So go baller on the wheels. So that's what I think. What do you guys think? Do you guys agree, disagree? Is there a place where you would have spent more or spent less? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure you will. If you like this content, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon, where, speaking of components, you can get a ton of awesome discounts on lots of cool components, like those Yokozuna brakes I mentioned. 20% off at the Soma Fab store for Patreon supporters. And as always, keep the supple side down.